Well, thank you for being here, folks. And for those of you who are guests, welcome to the Newman Center. And this is our Ash Wednesday triple play. Before we go any further, please join me in thanking everyone who is involved in making the soup and bread. I had an idea about an opening prayer, and then something happened in the liturgy, and I decided to change how I would do it. And God said, "Come back to me with all your heart. Don't let fear keep us apart. Trees do bend, though straight and tall, so must we to others call. The wilderness will lead you to your heart, where I will speak integrity and justice. With tenderness you shall know. You shall sleep secure with peace. Faithfulness will be your joy. Long have I waited for your coming home to me and living deeply our new life." And the people said, "Amen." It was about maybe 4 months ago that I was in a prayer and spirituality committee meeting, and we were talking about the budget that said, whoops, you'll have to reset it. Okay, so prayer and spirituality committee was meeting, I think it was in September, and we were talking about the budget for speakers, and somebody said, wouldn't it be nice to have someone talk about Pope Leo? And then I brought that to the Peace and Social Justice Committee, and they said, how about his focus on those in poverty? And that started the ball rolling. And in December, we learned about Cecilia Flores, whom you're about to meet. She's the executive director of the Catholic Volunteer Network with a focus on racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yep, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her experience spans years of service with Missioners of Christ in Honduras, and you'll learn some of what that was like for her, as well as her time as a campus ministry director in Sacramento, California. She holds a BA in philosophy from San Francisco State University and a master's in global development and social justice from St. John's University, I'm assuming New York. Okay. She does know that there's another one. Anyway, she's passionate about community organizing, storytelling, and raising her children, Kiara and Jacob. Her guiding quote is from St. Oscar Romero. "The poor are the ones who tell us what the world is and what service the church must offer to the world." Please join me in welcoming Cecilia Flores.
Over here. Okay, you gave me all the instructions, and just like me, I totally forgot. Good evening. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me here. I've been sharing, this is my first time in Minnesota, and this is the farthest north I've ever been. I was born in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my parents are immigrants from the Philippines, so I spent a lot of time traveling across the Pacific Ocean, more close to the equator. So this is definitely a different experience. I've shared, my family was fishermen, but that involved little boats, big nets, open water. I've heard a lot about ice fishing in my time here, so that has been very interesting to learn. But it's been such a blessing to be here. I arrived yesterday. I'll be here through very early Friday morning when I go back to Dallas, Texas, where I live now. Just a bit about me, which you've probably been looking. I'm Filipino American, so born in the U.S., child of immigrants. Mother of two, so those are my two kids. That's an old picture, so they're a lot bigger now, which makes me kind of sad. But that's Kiara, she's now 11, and that's Jacob, he is 9, turning 10 in a couple of months. And that says mother of 20, that's not true. The 0 is a typo. I hope that's not a prophecy of any sort. But I've been in ministry and service, it says 20 plus years, but I started when I was a child, in church ministry, going to the parish with my parents where they are still members of St. Vincent de Paul. So I consider myself, I've been a part of ministry for very long, but I've done youth ministry, served in a Newman center for many years, campus ministry, worked at the Catholic Charities doing immigration, legal services, food stamps, all those things. And then I also have been in community organizing for the past 10 years, and I'll share a little bit more about that. There was a 6-year stint in Central America as well, all looped in. My friends always joke, they say I've lived like 20 different lives, so we'll be having conversations and I'll pop out with a story. And it's a friend I've had for, since childhood. And they're like, when did that happen? When did you have time? Where in your, somewhere in there, I was blessed with that experience. And now I'm the executive director of the Catholic Volunteer Network. Just a quick thing about the Catholic Volunteer Network. So we are a network of close to 100 different faith-based service programs. So if you've ever heard of something like Jesuit Volunteer Corps, Vincentian Volunteer Corps, sometimes there's little maternity homes that are run, that are just local, and they're run by volunteers. They're part of our network. We have numbers of network members that are on the border. So Annunciation House is a pretty well-known one. They do service with people that are crossing the border. So we're the network of all of those, and we have a book. It's now online. I kind of missed the book. But it looked like a phone book, and it's like all the different faith-based opportunities you have. So it's kind of, we were founded 60 years ago by a priest whose sister left to be a teacher in Appalachia. And he thought it was the coolest thing ever. And he said, we should have something like the Peace Corps, but for Catholics. And that was the beginning of the Catholic Volunteer Network. And so now we're still around. We're still, serving. These are our members at our last conference. But say a prayer. I know there's a lot of programs that, due to budgets, due to COVID, due to many different things, they were no longer able to receive volunteers. They were having trouble recruiting volunteers, things like that. But service changed my life, so it's a big part of what I do now. And just a quick Newman connection. So these are my kids. That a lot of them are married with multiple kids now. But I was the director of a Newman Center in Sacramento, and I was sharing at my table. Ash Wednesday is one of my favorite days because we would go to campus to have Ash Wednesday services. And when we started going on campus, it started off as one mass. We had a classroom, and it was full, but it was like we could probably make this bigger, and it eventually grew. By the time I did my third and last Ash Wednesday, we were doing 4 masses on campus, all hundreds and hundreds of people flowing out. And our 6 p.m. mass that we started was actually geared toward all the people who worked at the university, because we noticed they'd try to catch the end of the afternoon mass to get their ashes, and we're already here. We should just have another one. So these are pictures from those events over the years, and the bishops would come to our Ash Wednesday because it was the best Ash Wednesday around. Bishop Soto, who's there, he would come to our campus and then head to the state capitol right after to do ashes there, and I just thought that was such a great witness. But Newman has just such a special place in my heart, and I've been made aware of kind of the changes that are happening here, and just know that you're all in my prayers. I know those types of transitions are very, very difficult, and I pray that it'll be approached as pastorally and with care as possible. So, quick little agenda. These are very short. It looks like a lot, but really it's like one slide per thing. But I'll talk a little bit just about Pope Leo's Lenten message, and then a little bit me and Pope Leo. It's clickbait is what that is. But I'll talk a little about me and Pope Leo, his life, and then when I was asked to speak about Pope Leo and his spiritual journey, it was a little intimidating. One, because he's kind of young, and he just became Pope. And there's no like biography of Pope Leo I can pick up at the store and read. And it was almost like a, you know, what do you talk about? There's so many things I think about myself, and what would someone say about me if they were told to give a presentation on me? So I wanted to really focus on things that I'm really big on, like practical, like how can I take something of that, the way that person lives their life, and apply it to the way that I live mine. So I don't consider myself a theologian in the traditional sense of the word. I don't have a theology degree. Have never been, you know, in seminary formation or anything like that. But you'll see how I think I do consider myself a theologian of the people in many ways. So Lent, that's from today. Isn't that cool? You can just go on the internet and get a picture of the Pope from Ash Wednesday. This was his, or Facebook, or anywhere these days. This is a quote from his Lenten message, which I thought was so great, and I love that Father mentioned it in the homily. So I won't read the whole thing, and I will send this presentation to Kevin so he can distribute it to you all, so don't feel the need to scribble stuff down. But what I really love that he mentions here is when he talks about fasting and hunger. This last bit here where he says, moreover, it helps us to identify and order our appetites, keeping our hunger and thirst for justice alive, and freeing us from complacency. Thus, it teaches us to pray and act responsibly towards our neighbor, which I grew up not thinking that's what Lent was. I grew up very much in kind of a very personal devotion, which you had shared, Father. Kind of like the mea culpa, sackcloth and ashes, you know, do the most extreme Lenten sacrifice you can. But it was never really oriented outside of me and myself, you know, and even with my friends, we'd always like, what are you giving up? What are you giving up? And we try to help each other, but it was never like a collective experience or prayer experience. So I thought this was just such a great quote from our current Pope, and a really great way to enter Lent. So here's my clickbait. So me and Pope Leo, I've been doing a lot of speaking on Pope Leo, and again, I'm not a Pope Leo expert, but some things that I really, there are things about him that I just identify so deeply with that I think are what I want to share tonight. So one of them is we overlapped at the same time in Latin America. So while I was in Honduras serving as a missionary, he was also serving as a missionary at that time in Peru. And these are, I found this picture of, that's Pope Leo. Now, you know, you see there's a lay person, there's some sisters, there's another priest. And I was like, that feels so familiar. And so I started going through my archives of photos, and, you know, this is me in Honduras. This is the local parish priest. We were in the mountains, and then, you know, we have nuns there too. But just this really interesting experience of what church was for me in Latin America, the movements of the timing that I was in Latin America, the time, and how we'll see that kind of evolve through Pope Leo's current teachings and what he's talking about. And more recently, I had the opportunity to attend the World Meeting of Popular Movements. So the World Meeting of Popular Movements was started by Pope Francis at the beginning of his papacy. And he wanted to gather all of the social movements, not just Catholic, but just globally. And so he brought together a group. The first, they've had 5 of these now. But it included, you know, faith-based community organizers, labor unions. It included, you know, people on the ground doing any grassroots work, peacekeeping work, depending on the region of the world. And they would all get together, and you would be divided into groups to talk about what you were seeing on the ground wherever it was you were from. So I had the blessing to participate in 2021, the World Meeting of Popular Movements with Pope Francis, which was an amazing experience. And part of the dynamic is when you meet in your group, you write like a collective summary. It's kind of a mad sprint because, you know, you're like writing the summary. The Pope then reads it, and then you have an audience with him and he responds. So it's kind of like this really quick letter writing response dynamic. It's really cool. And not everybody there is Catholic. But it's all people who are working for peace and justice in their different settings. So this was the most recent one, which was in Rome, and it was the first one with Pope Leo. And it was really interesting, I think, for us, having already experienced this with Pope Francis. We weren't sure there would be a 5th World Meeting of Popular Movements, because, you know, the Pope Francis started it, we weren't sure, and sure enough, we heard there would be another one, and we had a delegation of 20 from the US, but the delegates were from all over the world, really large representation from Africa, also from Argentina. That makes sense. But you know, there was a representative from Palestine, people from, you know, all over, and it was really interesting, I think, as an American living in this country at this time, to be in that space. I had lunch with some folks from the parish earlier, and I was sharing when, you know, there was almost like a how would I put it? When everyone's sharing, you know, I think we live with such a privilege being in the United States that sometimes we can go our entire lives without witnessing or seeing abject poverty. And so for some of the people on the delegation who hadn't had that exposure, they were very, I think, impacted when they were hearing from the other countries. Because, you know, we weren't all together. They intentionally split you up. It's supposed to be a synodal process. And you know, one of the men who was from the Liberian delegation shared that he was a child soldier, and he was sharing how that impacted his life and how now he is involved in rehabilitation for children. You know, it was part of his story. It wasn't the story, right? But for someone who's never heard that, it was very impactful, and there were so many, countless stories of that nature that were shared. And I think that, you know, looking back on that experience, what really impacted me was so many of the people that we met there were looking at us, like the delegation from the US, which, you know, and they're like, we're praying for you guys, we see what's happening. And it was a very, you know, I grew up in the US, so I do have that kind of like American pride, you know. I love this country. I love that my parents, you know, they gave up of land they love to build a life here. And now I have all these opportunities, and it was just kind of like, what is happening? Like, but they were saying, you know, we see what's happening, and we are praying for you, and we're seeing how people are responding, and how, and it's beautiful. And it was just kind of this really big moment for me to back up and just say, like, wow, this is really, really a moment that the world is also looking at how the country is reacting to what's happening, but in a special way in that meeting, how the church in this country is reacting to what's happening. So that's always been kind of at the forefront of my mind. And I'll send a link out that has the full, you know, the full message that's him there. And that's a young woman from our delegation, actually, that's Lupe. She was chosen to read our message to the Pope. She's 23 years old, lives in New York City. She's a street vendor. She's part of the Street Vendor Union in New York City. And she grew up in New York. And she remembers sleeping under her mother's cart because they'd be open really late. And now she's a street vendor herself. And she was chosen of all the delegates, you know, to read the message to the Pope. And we were kind of like, do you really want like someone from the American delegation? Like, we feel like someone, and they were like, no, like this is the moment, you know, like let's put that forward as a young person from the United States who's a child of immigrants to read this message on behalf of the world. I thought was such a powerful moment. And, you know, Pope Francis used this phrase a lot as well, but talking about people who work for justice, calling them social poets. Just such a beautiful expression of what it means to care for neighbor. He even mentions it's like, it's artistry, the way that we move and breathe and work with one another. So that's just a bit about me and Pope Leo. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture with him yet. So I'm not going to go too much into like the details because you can all Google, but I always find it fun to just see, you know, the first Pope from the United States. What is that like? What does that mean? I was riffing with some friends the other day and we were talking about Lent. And they're like, what do you think Pope Leo's like favorite Lenten song is? You know, I'm like, oh yeah, he probably went to like Mass and sang the same songs we sang. So like he probably has a favorite Lenten hymn in English. That's like a pretty cool concept. But you see, he was from a devout Catholic family. They say he showed interest in the priesthood very young. He'd play Mass. His brothers thought it was annoying in one of the articles I read. But he entered Augustinian formation at the age of 13. And, you know, that's back when high school seminaries were a prominent thing. But I think about that, and my daughter is 11, right? And I'm like, so that'd be like if she left home at the age of 13. So I really was thinking, you know, to really understand Pope Leo, we have to understand what it means to be an Augustinian, because so much of his formation took place within the context of his religious community. But one of the messages that he shared, I love that popes meet with everyone too. Like you could just like look it up, but this was a message to like altar server, some children altar servers at some random thing he did. But it mentions here what he loved about altar serving. He says what mattered wasn't so much the language of the celebration, but the experience of meeting other kids who also served at Mass together. The sense of friendship, and above all, being close to Jesus and the church. So I thought that was just so cool that, one, he met with children altar servers, and two, his message wasn't really about, the actual act of service, but just the sense of community he built being an altar server. I thought that just really spoke a lot. And this is him as a math tutor for all my math friends. He also majored in math and tutored. So it's very wholesome in some ways to just think about that. Like, that's not too far from here, right? You can drive to Chicago from here, right? Is that true? I don't know. So, this is somewhere in Chicago. This is happening. Our current pope is being formed by parents in the community. Like, that's so amazing to think about now, right? Like how we're raising our kids, or how you've raised your kids, how are you influencing them and your grandchildren, and what that could really mean, not only for your family, our church, but for the world. And you see that now happening with Pope Leo in such a real way. A bit about Augustinians. So I went down an Augustinian rabbit hole. Truthfully, I didn't know much about the Augustinians until Pope Leo became Pope. I've heard, done a lot of Jesuit things, a lot of Franciscan things, some Benedictine here and there, because my friends went to a Benedictine seminary. I was like, what are the Augustinians? And so there are, you can read more about their rule of life and all those things, but these are 4 themes that are very prevalent in what it means to be an Augustinian. So one of those is the restless heart. This is one of the most famous, St. Augustine quotes. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So this idea that we're constantly searching and pursuing God in everything that we do. So that's one of them. The other, and I love how it's spelled out this way, but it's the spirituality of togetherness, which I thought was beautiful. We hear community a lot. We hear communion a lot, and sometimes it's almost kind of just thrown around, community, like, togetherness. What does that really mean? And this is actually from one of their websites, but they are a community of brothers who live harmoniously together, united by a single soul and single heart, seeking God together and open to the service of the church. So when you think about that in the context, there's young Pope Leo there. I think about like 13-year-old Pope Leo learning about these things at such a young age in such a real way. Then charity as well. So Augustinians are big on mission work and serving others. So they mention it here. Charity unites us in Christ, helping us to recognize the signs of God's love in the events and circumstances of life. And then the last one, humility and poverty, very common for religious orders, but the reliance on God. And I love how their order specifically mentions, it says, we make use of the goods on earth as tools on our way toward our heavenly homeland. So really beautiful and really deep, because it's so rooted in just the writings of St. Augustine and who St. Augustine was. And you see that now, he's still so Augustinian, which I love. This was a picture where they said he just popped up at the Augustinian home in Rome, because I don't know, I guess he wanted to have lunch with his brothers kind of thing, and it was like a surprise to everyone. And this is him when he was in Philadelphia. They're all holding the peace sign. It's so funny. And then that's when I found of him in the Philippines. But the sense of community, being a religious brother and being an Augustinian, you can tell it means so much to him, which I think, as people who are formed in parishes and families, that we have that same sense, of what it means to be together. And I often think about that as him now being, in the papal apartment at the Vatican, when he's used to living with, all his brothers, and how that is probably hard for him too. And, it shows a very human aspect of how he has to kind of navigate his new role and his new leadership. So now we'll go to his time in Latin America. So we know he was in Peru for about over 20 years. He went there as a young Augustinian, so that's like at the top there you'll see when he was younger. He spent years there in parishes, and then he spent time later when he was older as a bishop. And when I was doing my research, I learned that where he was appointed bishop was actually kind of an Opus Dei. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, more conservative, but it was like an Opus Dei stronghold. And he was one of Pope Francis's first appointees. And, he put in Pope Leo, who is, a little bit counter to that culture in some ways, which a lot of people saw as Francis, like, putting his stamp on what the leadership of our church was going to look like. And I really think, having spent time in Latin America myself, that this is, we're seeing it now. So much of what he experienced and learned and loved about spending time with the people in Latin America have formed what we are seeing today. And so this is, there's so much stuff on the internet. It's really, really interesting. You can see this is young Pope Leo there at some type of peace march happening in Peru. I thought that was like the coolest sort of, here he is. And from Vatican II, I know y'all are a Vatican II parish, which I love. But, from Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, the church has a duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times. So when Pope Leo first went to Latin America, that was a really interesting time. I'm not sure how much you all know about Latin American history, but all kinds of political turmoil left and right, and a lot of poverty and a lot of suffering. And that is when he landed there, right, as a missionary, as a priest, like trying to serve the people. And what was really happening during this time is, in light of Vatican II, the leadership of the church was trying to read the signs of the times. And so they were grappling with, well, what does that mean for us as a church when we are seeing, political violence, we are seeing repression of free speech, we're seeing, our people living in abject poverty with no help, all of what they were seeing. And they really took a look, and they took the message of Vatican II at heart. So a lot of what we know now today as, liberation theology came kind of rooted in this desire to understand what it meant to be a church that is responsive to the signs of the times in the spirit of Vatican II. And so here he is as a bishop standing after a flood. So Peru, lots of natural disasters, not a lot of government aid that's able to come in for different reasons, a lot of remote work, rural work. So this is a quote from one of his very close advisors, but it says here, he taught the people in his communities that theory cannot determine reality, rather that reality comes first, then it is thought about, reasoned with, and then we can talk about theory. That's where you can see that this Pope is Latin American. So this idea that theology isn't from a book that we then apply, but that we have to learn from what's happening to then inform how we approach things. And I experienced this so much when I was living in Honduras because the realities were just so different from what I was used to. I shared at lunch, I had my conversion, back to the faith where I really embraced it as my own, in the context of a youth retreat. And it was a Eucharistic retreat. Adoration was the big thing. And I, encountered Jesus in the Eucharist and adoration. And from there, our church at the time was very big on adoration, holy hours, encouraging people to go to daily mass. And it was great for my faith at that time. I felt called to be a missionary, so I left. I went to live in Honduras, and I learned very quickly the reality of parish life in Honduras. So the shortage of priests was incredible. The remoteness of some of the villages was just so far, so disconnected from the world. And so we would serve in the rural areas. You'd have one priest serving, assigned to 100, they called them aldeas, so like little villages, 100 of them, one priest who lives hours and hours away. And we would serve in these parishes. And I went once, and one of the places was, they hadn't had a confirmation in 10 years. We went to do, so I'm like, this is, they maybe have mass once a year. They maybe, have access to sacraments, but they rely on lay leadership in these villages to, they do celebration of the word. They do communion services if they're able to. If the priest gets there once a year, he'll consecrate a bunch to hopefully, it's a very different dynamic than what we're used to. And I remember going to serve at a confirmation retreat. So we were going to do the confirmation. We did the retreat the same day. That was a whole other thing. And, I'm thinking, I'm trying to prepare my talk. And I'm used to being here in the U.S., a really fresh missionary. And I'm thinking, well, I usually talk about how, I love to go to adoration. I go to daily, and I'm sitting here, trying to prepare a talk. I don't know anything else to say. And I'm like, there's no way that I'm supposed to talk to them about God, and I have nothing to say that is actually accessible to them. And I don't believe that that's how God works. So then that was a really big aha moment for me to say, well, my spirituality is incomplete, or I'm just not aware. And so that was kind of my internal revolution of really learning, okay, what is actually doable? What is actually accessible? And so if all my spirituality is rooted in things these people don't have access to, and yet at the same time, they're a part of our church, and in some ways they're much more faithful to the gospel than I am, what am I supposed to learn here? And so that's when I started to really, at the time I was in Latin America, so we were learning a lot about liberation theology, but also the conclusions of the Aparecida conference that happened, which is, I recommend that one highly. That was a Latin American Bishops' Conference document. So you can see that here, he talks about it a lot. He often refers to his time in Peru. And he actually mentioned this, I say in his address to me and my friends, it was the World Meeting of Popular Movements, but in his address to me and my friends, he mentions, he experienced a church while he was in Peru that accompanies people in their sorrows, their joys, their struggles, and their hopes. And he says, this is an antidote to the spreading structural indifference that does not take seriously the drama of people who are stripped, robbed, sacked, and reduced to poverty. And you just see, all the pictures, if you look, of him in Latin America, he's always among the people. And there's no way, the Pope we experience now, we have because of the experience and the formation that he had there. And I think another key point that makes me really excited about him, is just the concept of shared leadership. So like I mentioned, in Honduras, they don't have priests that are able to get everywhere. So in each little village, they assign what they call a delegate of the word. And in my mind, they're functionally deacons, but that's a whole other. But they call them delegates of the word, and they're the ones who gather there's a spiritual leader of the community, and they're lay people, they're men and women, and they read the gospel, they give a homily of sorts, and then they run the communion service, and that's the Sunday obligation for the village. And that's all they have until the priest comes. And they're such a key part of the way the church functions, because the priest is only there once a year, twice a year, whatever the frequency is. And he's only there for such a split second of time, essentially, because he's driving 2 hours to the next village. It's a very intense life. So the relationship I saw in Latin America with bishops and priests and lay people was so different, because it was really there were, in their minds, and I think in practicality, there was no way they were going to be able to do it just relying on clergy. And they saw that need and responded to that need, and I think it's carried much throughout. We saw that a lot with Pope Francis, and I'm happy to say we're seeing that being continued now with Pope Leo. Quick story, this looks very scandalous. This was a very pivotal moment for me, and I love to share it because I think it's humbling for me to remember, but also I think impactful in many ways. And this is the village, Father Baltazar. He was assigned really high up in the mountains. It was already very far to get to the main parish, and he had, I think, 78, something like that, villages he was assigned to. And he was the one I was sharing. We went to do a confirmation. We had planned it because there hadn't been one there in 10 years. We were going to come, do the retreat the day before for all the confirmandi, and the next day have the confirmation. This is how it was structured. That was the only way. Now, I come from parish life in the United States, where there's a lot of paperwork, and there are, registration forms, and there are requirements and interviews, all of the things. Let's just say none of that was happening up there, and that was very hard for me to just adjust to. That was already a lot, but I was like, okay, I'm getting the vibes. I can do this. We get there. He's getting ready for Mass that day at the confirmation retreat, and somebody runs in and says, you know, so-and-so's daughter wants to get baptized. Can you do that right now? Me and my parish mind, you know, I'm like, well, no, you cannot. You need to fill out this form and that form, and then who are the godparents, and they need to send their forms. Then you have a class, you know, in my mind, I go through the list of all the things these people need to do before they get a baptism. And the priest is like, of course. I'm like, this is really different. I'm just having a moment where it's like, oh my gosh. And, you know, they do their thing. The girl, she ended up just participating in the confirmation retreat, which in many ways was probably more basic than what we would cover in confirmation, because they don't have regular faith formation happening in the villages. And they're looking before Mass. Obviously, it's kind of a lag. They're calling an audible. They're going to baptize this girl. And they're looking for a pitcher. And so someone says, I have a pitcher. I'll take care of it. So we're just getting ready for the Mass. And no one's paying attention to what the pitcher looks like. And we're going. You know, comes time for the baptism after the homily. And this is the pitcher. Now, my reaction internally was just like, no, like, we've already not done paperwork, we have no preparation, where is this going to be registered? And now there's a pineapple. Like, this is too much. Like, Holy Spirit, I don't know what you're trying to do, but this is going to be my breaking point. And it was kind of this realization of, are you going to stand in the way like of God's grace over a pineapple pitcher? And granted, this is a very extreme situation, so I don't think you'll be encountering this in your daily lives, but it was one of those moments where I really felt kind of this freedom to just let it go. Like, God is going to move. These people are experiencing grace. They're experiencing God, and you're here. Why are you so hung up on this? Like, worry about it later. Get this girl baptized. And so she was baptized. We had, I think, it was around 40, 45 confirmandi that ended up being confirmed that weekend. It was just such a powerful experience to see. And this is one of those examples I think of when I think of what does it mean to have, you know, a spirituality and a theology that's rooted in reality. Because me knowing all the rules that I know, I'm thinking of the rules. I was kind of formed to think of the rules. I think a lot of our American catechesis is very rule-oriented. So this was very hard for me to just even participate in. I'm like, I don't want to be associated with this, you know. But what a beautiful moment, you know. And this girl, actually, amazing story. She ended up participating, becoming confirmed, became a youth leader in our village, and then moved into our mission house 2 years later. So it was just, and now she went back to her village. She was able to go to college. She's now a counselor, she does counseling and psychology for youth that are recovering from drug addiction. And to think I could have stood in the way because of the pineapple pitcher, you know, really kind of puts things into perspective of how are we really responding to what we're seeing right in front of us, and, you know, the very typical, you know, what would Jesus do? What would God want? And it's like, okay, the rules exist to facilitate things, but that doesn't mean God is bound to those rules to move. And that's a big thing that I had to learn given the formation that I had. So that's a very great moment for me. Oh no, okay. So, story time aside, now I want to talk about the 4 themes that I found as I was kind of researching and looking into the life of Pope Leo. So we mentioned, you know, the Augustinians, St. Augustine, and then I know you're all a Vatican II parish, and I know you're going to be studying De Lexite. So when Kevin was sending me all the things, I was like, how am I going to tie this together? This is so many things. And sure enough, the Holy Spirit. So I learned St. Augustine is the most quoted Pope Father in Vatican II. He is referenced so many times, the different approaches to his spirituality, from his writings, his homilies, from his books, were foundational in how that, you know, the council was carried out and in the documents that were actually produced from it. So in some ways, a lot of what we read in Vatican II has kind of an Augustinian flavor to it. And so in many ways, when you meet Pope, you read what Pope Leo is saying, it's not only that he's a Vatican II proponent, which we know because now he's recatechizing the Church on Vatican II, but it also ties back to his roots in the Augustinian order, and that's part of his spirituality. So in some ways, it's like it really is who he is. When we read De Lexi Te, you're reading a lot of spirituality that's also in Vatican II, and you're reading a lot of what St. Augustine taught and brought us as a church. And so these are 4 central themes that I drew out of just all of the stuff that I was reading and digesting. But 1, love as the center of the Christian life. And I know we throw love around. We just had Valentine's Day, and we love people, but we also love pizza, right? Like, love is such a haphazard word sometimes, but we see this of how much, right? I mean, De Lexi Te, I have loved you. You see, there's like a through line. You see St. Augustine, what he said, right? My weight is my love. Wherever I'm carried, my love is carrying me. Second Vatican Council, it talks about, a sign and instrument, communion of God, unity, and then love for the Lord, love for the poor. So we see that love is not just a funny word, it's not a cute thing, it's not just an emotion, but it's really core to who we are as Christians. And we know this, right? We sing that song, they'll know we're Christians by our love, by our love. So I bet Pope Leo knows that one too. But so, love. And I really like, and I was reading the first reading today, and like it references like the heart. And it references us, coming back to loving one another. And I just think that is so core to who we are. And it's like sometimes we kind of write off when we hear love, right? Oh, it's so cheesy. It's like it really is a beautiful core. And that goes back not just to Pope Leo de Lexi Te, but it goes all the way back, right? And you can obviously to Jesus, but St. Augustine in this case. The next one, the restless heart and the ongoing conversation. So I love this. We know St. Augustine's crazy story and the way that he, had to come back to God many times, and just like we did. And so this idea that the Christian path and being committed to the Lord and pursuing a relationship is exactly that. It's a pursuit. It is an ongoing thing. We have to continue to grow. We have to continue to learn. We have to continue to come more into communion and in deeper communion with God. And I think that is such a beautiful thing to think. And I think specifically for the time that we're in now, we're so polarized, right? Where everything feels so binary, and it's right and it's wrong. You're either on the right side or the wrong side. And I won't, there are some things that I think are very clear, and that's not the things I'm talking about, but when we think about how we're approaching what we see, we're very passionate about what we are passionate about. But there's also the humility that comes with that to understand, well, but I don't know everything. That was like my aha moment when I was in Honduras. Well, there were a lot of them. But, this idea that we have to be on this journey continuously. And God is continuing to reveal himself to us through people, through encounters, through relationships. And so we have to be open to being moved. That's how when I hear this, I'm like, okay, I don't really like being moved, right? I believe what I believe for a reason. And it doesn't matter if you're young or old, we all have room. There's still more of God for us to receive. So that's a beautiful thing that you see, again, throughout those 3 things, St. Augustine, Vatican II, and De Lexi Te. Listening, which was so good in Father's homily, listening and synodal discernment. So it's so interesting to me that, we had this whole global synod process, and it's still continuing and it's implemented, and that so many people had such a problem, like they just didn't like the concept of synodality or of listening to one another in communion, because it's so rooted in who we are as a people and as a communion. So you can read here, from St. Augustine, do not go outside, return inward, but then let us listen together to him who is our master. Lumen Gentium from Vatican II, the whole body of the faithful cannot err in matters of belief. And I always read that, and it says the whole body. That's the key there, not just my group of friends in our echo chamber, but the whole body, right? It cannot err, but what does that mean? We have to know the whole body. We have to keep meeting the whole body to be able to really discern together as a community. And then Pope Leo hammers it in harder, and he talks about the poor. We talk about preferential option for the poor. We have to be listening to the poor. So not only are we listening as a spiritual practice, but we also have to listen to what the poor are saying. That's why that's my guiding quote from St. Oscar Romero, is that we learn so much when we listen. And then finally, again, this one is my favorite. Theology that emerges from lived reality. City of God is a great read for this time of the world. So if you've not read City of God by St. Augustine, 10 out of 10 recommend. But you see this here. St. Augustine talks about two cities have been formed by two loves, the earthly by the love of self and the heavenly by the love of God. And then you see here Gaudium et Spes. I love this quote from Gaudium et Spes. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, these are the joys, hopes, griefs, and anxieties of the followers of Christ. I think that's just such a powerful thing. This idea that what pains one part of the body pains the whole body. I think we've gotten away from that in many ways. And then, love Dilexi Tay. No one who fails to love the poor can truly love God. So Jesus said that too in many different ways. So many of the saints are, but hammering it in again. So these are these 4 main themes here that I leave with you to just kind of reflect on and to think about, maybe delve into which one really you feel like you want to work on more, you want to learn or read more about. And then I have just some reflection questions here. So each question is related to one of those pillars, but these are questions you can take with you and think about as you enter into this restless season, reflecting with Augustine and Vatican II, Pope Leo. So number 1, what is love? Where is love actually ordering my decisions right now? What would change if I measured my work, my life, and my relationships by whether they deepen communion? 2, where do I sense restlessness in my life? What might that restlessness be inviting me to let go of or to grow into? Who am I not listening to? Where might Christ be speaking through voices or experiences I tend to overlook? And when do I feel called not to only listen, but to speak up with clarity and courage? And the last one, what concrete experiences of my life or community are shaping how I understand God today? How are the joys and wounds around me calling forth a deeper and more embodied faith? So these are questions I'm working on and through this Lent myself. But I just invite you, in times that are difficult, not only as a country, but for you all as a community, I always tell myself, I can only control what I can control, and that's me. And how do I continue to ask God in every situation, what are you saying through this? What am I supposed to be learning? What am I supposed to be receiving? How am I supposed to be reacting? As a person who loves you and loves the church and loves your people. So I leave you with that. And again, I'll send this all to Kevin so he can share with people. And if anybody wants to stay in touch, I always just leave my contact info here. That's our website, and that's my email if anybody wants to riff or talk fun things, share stories. I'm always open for some stories sharing. So thank you all.